30,000 feet in the air, in the first-class cabin of Flight 2847, an 8-year-old black girl named Bethany Clark stood between her grandfather and a flight attendant who was demanding they move to the back of the plane. The flight attendant, Veronica Ashford, towered over the child with her arms crossed, her British accent dripping with condescension as she repeated her demand that the elderly black man beside Bethany relocate to economy class. Bethany looked up at Veronica with unflinching eyes and said clearly, loudly enough for everyone in first class to hear, "You need to apologize to my grandfather. Right now." Veronica's face flushed red. She leaned down, her voice sharp as a knife. "Little girl, adults are talking. Go sit down before I have security remove both of you from this aircraft." But Bethany didn't move. Instead, she reached into her small backpack, pulled out her iPhone, held it up, and pressed record. The camera captured everything. Veronica's face. Her grandfather's quiet dignity. The other passengers watching in stunned silence. But to understand how an 8-year-old girl ended up protecting her grandfather at 30,000 feet, we need to go back. 6 hours earlier. 6 hours before that confrontation, Bethany Clark sat alone in the cafeteria of Millbrook Academy, one of the most prestigious private elementary schools in Greenwich, Connecticut. While other third graders threw food, gossiped about birthday parties, and traded Pokemon cards, Bethany had her tablet propped against her lunch tray, scrolling through the Wall Street Journal Kids section. She was reading an article about semiconductor tariffs and international trade policy. At the table nearest to her, 3 girls whispered just loud enough for Bethany to hear. "She's so weird," one of them said. "Who reads the news at lunch?" another added, giggling. "My mom says her parents died and that's why she's strange now." Bethany heard every word. She'd heard variations of it for 2 years now, ever since the accident. Ever since the car crash that took her mother and father on a rainy Tuesday evening when they were driving home from her 6th birthday party. But she didn't look up. She didn't cry. She just kept reading because that's what her grandfather taught her to do. Stay strong. Stay focused. Don't let them see you break. Miss Peterson, Bethany's homeroom teacher, noticed her sitting alone like she did every day. She walked over with that concerned look adults always had when they saw Bethany by herself, that mixture of pity and worry that made Bethany's skin crawl. "Bethany, sweetheart," Miss Peterson said gently, crouching beside her. "Don't you want to go play with the other children? Maybe join a game outside?" Bethany looked up from her tablet, her expression polite but distant. "I'm fine, Miss Peterson. I'm reading about semiconductor tariffs and how they're affecting global supply chains. It's actually quite fascinating." Miss Peterson blinked, unsure how to respond to an 8-year-old who talked like a Harvard economics professor. "Well, that's wonderful, honey, but socialization is important too. You've been eating alone every day this week." "I prefer it this way," Bethany said simply. "Other kids don't really understand what I'm interested in." What Miss Peterson didn't understand, what none of the teachers or students understood, was that Bethany wasn't trying to be difficult or antisocial. She was surviving. After losing her parents, after watching her whole world collapse in a single moment, she'd learned to find comfort in facts, in numbers, in things that made sense. The stock market made sense. Economics made sense. People didn't. People died. People left. People hurt you even when they didn't mean to. So Bethany read. And studied. And waited for the only person in the world who truly understood her to pick her up from school. At 3:15, Bethany walked out of Millbrook Academy's front doors, her backpack heavy with homework and library books about finance and business. In the pickup line, expensive SUVs and luxury sedans idled, parents in designer clothes scrolling through their phones. And then there was her grandfather's car. A 12-year-old Toyota Camry with a small dent in the passenger door and a faded paint job. Theodore Clark, 72 years old, sat behind the wheel wearing a worn cardigan with patches on the elbows and slacks that had seen better days. When Bethany climbed into the passenger seat, her grandfather's entire face transformed. The lines around his eyes deepened as he smiled, his weathered hands reaching over to gently squeeze her shoulder. "There's my brilliant girl," Theo said warmly. "How was school today, baby girl?" Bethany's own expression softened in a way it never did for anyone else. "It was fine, Grandpa Theo. We learned about the American Revolution, but I already knew most of it from the books you gave me." She paused, then added carefully, "Can we get ice cream before we go to the airport?" Theo's smile widened. "Ice cream it is. We've got time before our flight." As Theo pulled away from the school, Bethany noticed other parents staring at their old car, whispering to each other. She saw the judgment in their eyes, the same judgment she saw everywhere. People looked at her grandfather in his simple clothes and old car and they made assumptions. They saw an elderly black man who must be struggling, who couldn't possibly belong in their wealthy neighborhood, who was probably the help rather than a parent. They had no idea who Theodore Clark really was. And that was exactly how he wanted it. 20 minutes later, Bethany and Theo sat in a small ice cream shop on the corner of Greenwich Avenue, the kind of place that had been there for 40 years and refused to modernize. Bethany had ordered her usual, vanilla soft serve with rainbow sprinkles. Theo had black coffee. "You know," Theo said, watching his granddaughter carefully arrange her sprinkles into a pattern, "when I was your age I couldn't afford ice cream. Couldn't afford much of anything, really?" Bethany looked up. She loved her grandfather's stories, the way he could make the past feel alive and real. Theo continued, his voice carrying the weight of memory. "I grew up in Alabama in a town so small it didn't even have a proper name. My father worked in a factory, my mother cleaned houses. We had one pair of shoes between me and my two brothers, so we took turns wearing them to school. On my days without shoes, I'd walk on the side of the road where the dirt was softer, trying not to step on anything sharp. And now you own the company that makes them," Bethany said quietly. It wasn't a question. She knew her grandfather's story by heart, but she never tired of hearing him tell it. Theo nodded slowly. "Clark Global Industries. Started in a garage with borrowed money and a dream. 43 years later, we're in 70 countries, employing 200,000 people." He reached across the small table and took Bethany's hand. "But you know what, baby girl? I still remember exactly what it felt like to be invisible. To walk into a room and have people look right through me like I wasn't even there. That's why we stay humble. That's why I drive an old car and wear old clothes. Because the moment you forget where you came from, the moment you forget what it feels like to be dismissed and overlooked, that's when you become the very thing you once feared." Bethany squeezed his hand. At 8 years old, she understood what he meant in a way most children never would. She'd felt invisible too. After her parents died, she'd felt like a ghost walking through her own life. "People will judge you by how you look, baby girl," Theo said, his voice firm but gentle. "They'll judge you by your clothes, your car, your skin color, your age. They'll make up stories about who you are before you even open your mouth. But you judge them by how they treat others. You judge them by their actions, by their kindness or lack of it. That's how you know who someone really is." Bethany nodded seriously, committing his words to memory like she did with everything he taught her. "Now," Theo said, his tone shifting to something lighter, "are you going to ask me about Miami or are you going to make me keep this surprise a secret?" Bethany's eyes lit up. "Please tell me. It's my birthday surprise, isn't it?" Theo chuckled. "You'll see when we get there. It's something special, I promise you that. Something I've been planning for a long time. Something that matters." "Is it a trip to Disney World?" Bethany guessed. "Better. A shopping spree? Even better. Grandpa Theo, you're killing me." Theo laughed, a deep, rich sound that made other customers in the ice cream shop turn and smile. "Patience, my dear. All good things come to those who wait. You'll find out soon enough. Now finish that ice cream. We've got a plane to catch." If you're loving Bethany and Theo's story so far, make sure to hit that subscribe button. You won't want to miss what happens next. JFK Airport's Terminal 4 buzzed with the controlled chaos of hundreds of travelers rushing to catch flights, dragging suitcases, arguing with gate agents and staring anxiously at departure boards. Theo and Bethany walked through the automatic doors, looking every bit like people who'd taken a wrong turn on their way to the bus station. Theo's worn cardigan had a small coffee stain on the collar. His slacks were clean but faded. His shoes, though polished, were scuffed and old. Bethany wore a simple floral dress that was slightly too big for her, hand-me-down from a cousin, and carried a backpack covered in pencil doodles instead of the designer bags other children her age carried. They made their way to the check-in counter where a young man with kind eyes and a slight accent stood behind the computer. His name tag read, Dmitry Volkov. "Good afternoon," Dmitry said with genuine warmth. "How may I help you today?" Theo handed over their tickets and passports. "Checking in for flight 2847 to Miami." Dmitry scanned the tickets and something flickered across his face. Surprise, perhaps, or confusion. He looked at the tickets again, then at Theo and Bethany, then back at the tickets. First-class seats. Last-minute booking. The kind that cost thousands of dollars. But Dmitry's professionalism never wavered. Whatever assumptions he might have made about the elderly black man and young girl in front of him, he kept them to himself. "Mr. Clark," Dmitry said respectfully, typing quickly, "I see you're booked in first class. Let me just make a small adjustment here." His fingers flew across the keyboard. I've moved you and Miss Bethany to seats 1A and 1B. Front row, extra legroom. More comfortable for the young lady. That's very kind of you, Theo said, his voice warm with appreciation. Thank you. Dimitri printed their boarding passes and handed them over with a smile. My pleasure, sir. I hope you both have a wonderful flight. But not everyone at the check-in counter was as gracious as Dimitri. Behind Theo and Bethany in line stood Gerald Whitmore, a man in his 50s wearing a Rolex that cost more than most people's cars, designer shoes that squeaked against the airport floor, and an expression of perpetual irritation. He'd been sighing loudly and checking his watch every 30 seconds, making it clear to everyone around him that his time was far too valuable to be wasted standing in line. As Dimitri handed the boarding passes to Theo, Gerald caught a glimpse of them. First class. Row 1. Gerald's face twisted into something between disbelief and disgust. He actually laughed, a short, sharp sound without humor. First class? Seriously? The comment hung in the air. Other passengers nearby turned to look. Dimitri's fingers froze over his keyboard. Theo heard it. Bethany heard it. Everyone heard it. But Dimitri, bless him, simply handed the boarding passes to Theo with quiet dignity, looked him directly in the eye and said clearly, "Have a wonderful flight, Mr. Clark. You and your granddaughter deserve it." Theo took Bethany's hand and walked toward security, his head held high, his steps measured and calm. Bethany, however, glanced back at Gerald Whitmore. She studied his face, his expensive clothes, his contemptuous expression. She was only 8 years old, but she understood exactly what had just happened. She understood the judgment in his laugh, the assumptions behind his words. And she remembered what her grandfather had taught her. Judge people not by how they look, but by how they treat others. So here's my question for you. Have you ever witnessed discrimination like this? Have you ever seen someone judged just because of how they looked? Let me know in the comments below. As Theo and Bethany moved through security and toward their gate, neither of them knew that Gerald Whitmore would also be on flight 2847. Neither of them knew that the check-in counter was just the beginning. Neither of them knew that in a few short hours, Bethany would be standing in a first-class cabin with her phone out, recording, protecting her grandfather from something far worse than a stranger's scornful laugh. But they would find out soon enough. Because sometimes, the people who judge you by your appearance are the same ones who need to learn the hardest lessons about who really deserves respect. And Bethany Clark, 8 years old, brilliant beyond her years and braver than anyone gave her credit for, was about to teach them all a lesson they would never forget. Flight 2847 to Miami was scheduled to depart at 6:45 p.m. By 6:15, passengers had begun boarding, streaming down the jet bridge with their carry-on luggage, their neck pillows, their coffee cups from airport cafes, all of them eager to claim their seats and settle in for the 2.5-hour flight. Theo and Bethany were among the first to board, their first-class tickets granting them priority access. As they stepped onto the aircraft, they were greeted by 3 flight attendants standing near the galley, each wearing the crisp navy blue uniform of Sapphire Airlines. The lead flight attendant was a woman named Veronica Ashford. She was in her early 40s, with blonde hair pulled back into a tight bun that seemed to stretch her face into a permanent expression of stern disapproval. Her British accent added an air of authority to everything she said, and she carried herself with the kind of rigid posture that suggested she took her position very, very seriously. Too seriously, perhaps. Standing beside Veronica was Patricia Montgomery, a woman in her 50s with graying hair and eyes that darted nervously between passengers like she was constantly assessing threats. Patricia had worked as a flight attendant for 27 years, and in that time she'd learned that the easiest way to survive was to agree with whoever had the most power in the room. Right now, that was Veronica. The third flight attendant was James Chin, 28 years old, with kind eyes and an apologetic smile that seemed to be his default expression. James was new to Sapphire Airlines, only 3 months into the job, and he still believed that being a flight attendant meant helping people, making them comfortable, ensuring they had a pleasant journey. He hadn't yet learned that some of his colleagues saw the job differently. They saw it as a position of power, a chance to decide who belonged and who didn't. Theo and Bethany made their way down the aisle to seats 1A and 1B, right in the front row of first class. The seats were spacious, upholstered in soft leather with plenty of legroom and small screens built into the headrests. Bethany's eyes widened slightly as she sat down. She'd flown before but never in first class. "Grandpa Theo, these seats are so big," she whispered. Theo smiled as he settled in beside her, carefully placing his worn canvas bag under the seat in front of him. "Enjoy it, baby girl. You deserve comfort." But not everyone thought so. Veronica Ashford had been conducting her pre-flight checks, scanning the cabin with the sharp eyes of someone looking for problems, when she spotted them. An elderly black man in a threadbare cardigan and scuffed shoes. A young black girl in a simple dress that looked like it came from a thrift store. Sitting in row 1. In first class. Veronica did a double take, her eyes narrowing. She glanced down at her passenger manifest, then back at Theo and Bethany, then back at the manifest again, as if the paper might suddenly reveal that a mistake had been made. She leaned toward Patricia, her voice a loud whisper that carried further than she probably intended. How did they afford first class? Patricia glanced over, saw Theo and Bethany, and her lips pursed into a thin line. She leaned back toward Veronica, matching her whisper. Probably used miles. Or someone else's credit card. The implication hung in the air like smoke. Someone else's credit card. As if the only way these two could possibly be in first class was through some kind of deception or theft. James Chen, standing a few feet away arranging blankets, heard the exchange. His hands froze mid-fold and something uncomfortable flickered across his face. He glanced at Theo and Bethany, then at Veronica and Patricia, then down at the blankets in his hands. You wanted to say something. You should say something. But he was new and Veronica was his superior, and what if he was wrong? What if there really was some kind of mistake? So James said nothing. And in that moment of silence, something shifted in the cabin. A line was drawn, invisible but undeniable. More passengers boarded. A woman in her 60s with silver hair and intelligent eyes took her seat in row 3. Her name was Linda Rosenberg and she'd been flying first class for decades, accumulating miles through her work as a literary agent in New York. She'd brought a hardcover novel with her, something literary and dense, but she found herself distracted by the tension she could feel building at the front of the cabin. A businessman named Raj Patel, 45 years old, settled into row 2 with his laptop already open, ready to work through the flight. He had a presentation to prepare, numbers to review, but he too noticed something in the air. The way the flight attendants kept glancing at row 1. The whispers. And then Gerald Whitmore boarded. Gerald, the man from the check-in counter who'd laughed at the idea of Theo and Bethany flying first class, strode down the aisle with the confidence of someone who'd never been told no in his entire privileged life. His carry-on bag was probably worth more than Theo's car. His suit was custom-tailored. His shoes gleamed. When Gerald saw Theo and Bethany sitting in row 1, his face twisted into an expression of theatrical disbelief, as if he'd just witnessed something personally offensive to him. He stopped in the aisle, turned to Veronica and said loud enough for half the cabin to hear, "Excuse me, I think there's been a mistake. Those seats are first class." Veronica straightened, and something in her expression suggested she'd been waiting for exactly this kind of validation. "I was just about to address that, Mr. Whitmore." She approached Theo with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, a smile that was all teeth and no warmth. "Sir, may I see your boarding passes, please?" Theo, ever calm, ever patient, reached into his pocket and handed over both boarding passes without a word. Veronica examined them with exaggerated care, holding them up to the light as if checking for watermarks, running her fingers over the printed text as if it might smudge and reveal itself as forgery. "These seats," she said slowly, 1A and 1B. "Are you quite sure you're in the right cabin?" Bethany, who'd been quietly observing everything with those sharp 8-year-old eyes that missed nothing, spoke up. "We checked in. The man at the counter gave us these seats." Veronica's smile tightened. "I see. Well, let me just verify with the gate. Sometimes there are computer errors. I'm sure you understand." She walked back toward the galley, boarding passes still in hand, leaving Theo and Bethany sitting in their seats with every eye in first class now turned toward them. Linda Rosenberg lowered her book, concern creasing her forehead. Raj Patel stopped typing. James Chin shifted his weight from foot to foot, his discomfort growing by the second. And Gerald Whitmore settled into his seat with a satisfied smirk, as if he'd just done everyone a favor by pointing out the obvious mistake. Veronica returned 3 minutes later. She'd gone to the cockpit, spoken with the gate agent via radio, verified the tickets against the passenger manifest. And she'd confirmed what she didn't want to believe: the tickets were valid. Theo and Bethany Clark were legitimately booked in seats 1A and 1B. But Veronica wasn't satisfied. Something about this didn't sit right with her. She'd been a flight attendant for 15 years and she prided herself on her ability to read people, to spot the passengers who didn't belong, who were trying to game the system, who needed to be reminded of their place. She approached Theo again, this time with the boarding passes in hand, but her expression even more suspicious than before. "Sir," she said, her British accent making each word sound like a small accusation, "these tickets were purchased last minute. That's quite expensive. May I ask how you acquired them? The question landed like a slap. Theo looked up at Veronica with patient, tired eyes. Eyes that had seen this before. Eyes that had witnessed decades of assumptions, of judgment, of people deciding who he was before he'd even opened his mouth. I purchased them, he said simply. Is there a problem? She stood up from her seat in row 3, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of 40 years of air travel, of privilege she'd never had to question until now, of shame that she'd watched this go on for as long as it had without saying anything. This is disgraceful, Linda said, and her voice shook with anger. I've been flying for 40 years and I have never, in all my life, seen such blatant discrimination. This woman hasn't done anything wrong. This child hasn't done anything wrong. They paid for their seats. They have a right to be here. And you, she pointed directly at Veronica, should be ashamed of yourself. Raj Patel, who'd been silent this whole time, who'd been trying to stay out of it, who'd told himself it wasn't his business, finally found his voice. She's right. This is wrong. This is completely wrong. But not everyone agreed. Gerald Whitmore let out an exasperated sigh and threw his hands up. Oh please. They're making a scene. This is exactly the kind of disruption that ruins flights for everyone else. They should just move and stop being so difficult. Veronica seized on this support like a lifeline. She turned to Linda. Ma'am, please sit down or I'll have to consider you disruptive as well. James Chin, who'd been standing near the back of first class watching this entire disaster unfold, finally stepped forward. Veronica, maybe we should just. Veronica whirled on him, and the frustration and embarrassment she'd been bottling up came pouring out. James, go check on economy. No. That's an order. James hesitated, his face a mask of conflict. He looked at Theo, at Bethany, at the tears in the little girl's eyes. Then he looked at Veronica's furious face. And he made a choice. The wrong choice. He turned and walked toward the back of the plane, leaving Theo and Bethany alone at the front. Veronica pulled out the intercom phone mounted near the galley. She pressed a button, and her voice echoed through the cabin speakers. Captain Davis, I need you in the cabin, please. A man's voice crackled back through the speaker. What's the issue, Veronica? We have passengers refusing to follow crew instructions. Potentially threatening behavior. Theo's eyes widened. We haven't threatened anyone. But Veronica ignored him. They're being belligerent. I'm requesting they be removed from the aircraft. I'll be right out, Captain Davis said. The cabin was absolutely silent now. Even the passengers boarding from economy, walking past first class on their way to their seats, could feel the tension. They slowed their steps, craned their necks, trying to see what was happening. Bethany looked up at her grandfather, and for the first time, real fear entered her eyes. Grandpa, are they going to make us leave? Theo pulled her close. I don't know, baby girl. I don't know. But Bethany's hand slipped into her backpack. Her fingers closed around her iPhone. And she thought about what her grandfather had taught her. About standing up. About speaking truth. About making sure that when injustice happened, there was a record of it. Here's my question for you. Would you have spoken up like Linda? Would you have stayed silent like Raj? What would you have done in that moment? Let me know in the comments. The cockpit door at the very front of the plane began to open. Captain Davis was coming out. And everything was about to change. Because in just a few moments, Bethany was going to pull out that phone. She was going to start recording. And she was going to say the words that would turn this entire situation on its head. You need to apologize to my grandfather. Right now. But we already know how that part goes. That's where we started. The cold open. The hook. The moment that made you stop scrolling and start watching. Now you understand how we got here. How an 8-year-old girl and her grandfather ended up in a battle for dignity at 30,000 feet. How prejudice and power collided. How silence from good people allowed bad behavior to flourish. How one child's courage became the spark that would ignite everything that came next. The captain was coming. The phones were recording. The truth was about to be revealed. And nothing would ever be the same again. The cockpit door opened and Captain Davis stepped into the first-class cabin. He was a man in his 50s with salt and pepper hair, a stern face weathered by years of flying, and the kind of presence that commanded immediate attention. He'd been flying commercial aircraft for 28 years, and in that time he'd dealt with every kind of passenger situation imaginable. Drugs. Fights. Medical emergencies. But this? A flight attendant requesting the removal of passengers before takeoff? This was serious. But before Captain Davis could even speak, before he could ask what was happening, Before Veronica could launch into her carefully constructed narrative about disruptive passengers and safety protocols, Bethany Clark did something that would change everything. She reached into her backpack, pulled out her iPhone, held it up so the camera faced Veronica Ashford and pressed record. The red recording light blinked on. Bethany's voice was calm, clear, and absolutely fearless. "State your name, please." Veronica's eyes went wide. Her face flushed crimson. "Put that away right now." "It's legal to record in public spaces," Bethany said, her 8-year-old voice steady as steel. "Aircraft cabins are considered public spaces under federal aviation law. Are you refusing us service because of our race?" Veronica lunged forward, reaching for the phone. "I said put that away." But Bethany was quick. She pulled the phone back, holding it close to her chest, the camera still recording, capturing everything. Theo stood up, placing himself between his granddaughter and Veronica, and for the first time since this entire ordeal began, his voice carried an edge. Not loud, not aggressive, but absolutely firm. "Don't touch her." And just like that, we were back at the beginning. The cold open. The hook. The moment that started this entire story. The elderly black man in worn clothes. The 8-year-old girl with a camera. The flight attendant losing her composure. The tension so thick you could cut it with a knife. This was the moment that would define everything that came next. Captain Davis stepped forward, his voice cutting through the chaos. "What's going on here?" Veronica whirled toward him and relief flooded her face. Finally, backup. Finally, someone with real authority who would see that she was just doing her job, just following protocol, just trying to maintain order on her aircraft. "Captain, these passengers are being disruptive, refusing to follow crew instructions. The child is now recording without permission, and they're creating a disturbance that's affecting the entire cabin." "We're sitting in our assigned seats," Bethany interrupted, her phone still recording, "and she's trying to move us to economy because we don't look wealthy enough. Because we're black." Captain Davis held out his hand. "May I see your boarding passes?" Theo handed them over. Captain Davis examined them, looked at the seat numbers, looked at where Theo and Bethany were sitting, looked back at the boarding passes. "These are valid first-class tickets. Seats 1A and 1B paid in full." "Yes, but Captain," Veronica said quickly, "there were concerns about how they were obtained. Last-minute booking, expensive tickets, and when I tried to verify." Captain Davis looked at her, his expression hardening. "Did you run the credit card?" Veronica blinked. "Well, no, but..." "Did you contact the booking agent?" "The gate confirmed the tickets were valid, but..." "Then what's the problem?" Captain Davis asked, and there was something dangerous in his voice now. He'd been flying long enough to recognize what was happening here. He'd seen it before. The assumptions. The profiling. The way some crew members used their authority not to serve passengers but to police them, to decide who belonged and who didn't based on nothing more than appearance. Veronica opened her mouth, but no words came out. Because there was no good answer. The problem wasn't the tickets. The problem wasn't the booking. The problem was her own prejudice, and now it was exposed for everyone to see. Theo Clark looked at Captain Davis with those tired, patient eyes that had witnessed this scene play out in 1,000 different ways over 7 decades of life. He could have been angry. He had every right to be angry. But instead he was simply weary. Weary of proving his humanity. Weary of justifying his existence. Weary of teaching lessons that should have been learned generations ago. "Captain Davis," Theo said quietly, "I don't want to make trouble. I never want to make trouble. But I think there's someone you should speak with." He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. Not a new phone. Not the latest model. Just a simple smartphone with a cracked screen protector. He scrolled through his contacts, found a name and pressed dial. The cabin was silent. Everyone watched. Gerald Whitmore in his expensive suit. Linda Rosenberg with her hand over her mouth. Raj Patel leaning forward in his seat. Patricia Montgomery frozen near the galley. James Chin standing in the aisle, afraid to move. And Veronica Ashford, whose face had gone from red to white, sensing that something was about to shift but not understanding what. The phone rang twice. Then a voice answered. "Hello, Richard?" Theo said, and his voice was warm now, familiar, like he was greeting an old friend. "It's Theo." "Yes, I'm well, thank you. I'm on one of your planes actually. Flight 2847 to Miami." He paused. "There's been a situation." Veronica's voice came out as a whisper. "Who is he calling?" Captain Davis's face changed. The color drained from his cheeks. His eyes widened. Recognition dawned slowly like sunrise, and with it came something that looked a lot like horror. "Sir," Captain Davis said slowly, carefully, as if he was afraid the answer might break him. "You're not, Mr. Clark?" Bethany, still holding her phone, still recording, looked up at the captain with those brilliant 8-year-old eyes and said clearly, "Theodore Clark, CEO of Clark Global Industries." Patricia Montgomery gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Veronica stumbled backward, shaking her head. "That's impossible. Clark Global Industries is worth $43 billion, Bethany finished. "My grandfather started it in a garage 43 years ago. Now it operates in 70 countries and employs over 200,000 people. He's also the largest shareholder in Sapphire Airlines. He owns 40% of this company." The silence that followed was deafening. You could have heard a pin drop in that first-class cabin. Every passenger, every flight attendant, every single person processing what they just heard. The elderly black man in the worn cardigan. The man they'd assumed was flying on someone else's miles. The man Veronica had tried to move to economy. The man she'd accused of credit card fraud. That man was Theodore Clark, billionaire, CEO, the single largest shareholder in the airline they were currently standing on. Theo continued his phone conversation, his voice still calm, still patient. "Richard, I'm going to hand you over to Captain Davis. I think you two should speak." He held out the phone to the captain. Captain Davis took it like it might explode in his hand. He brought it to his ear, and everyone in the cabin watched his face cycle through a dozen emotions in the span of 30 seconds. Disbelief, fear, understanding, and finally grim acceptance. "Mr. Morrison?" Captain Davis said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, sir. Yes, he's here. I understand. Of course. Right away, sir. Yes. I understand completely." He hung up the phone and handed it back to Theo. When he spoke, his voice shook slightly. "That was Richard Morrison, CEO of Sapphire Airlines." Veronica's knees seemed to buckle. She grabbed the nearest seat for support. Captain Davis continued, and each word felt like a hammer blow. "Mr. Clark here owns 40% of our company. He's our largest shareholder. He has a seat on the board of directors. And according to Mr. Morrison, Mr. Clark frequently flies under a private booking account to observe how staff treat regular passengers." The weight of those words settled over the cabin like a physical thing. Veronica had just tried to forcibly remove the owner of the airline from his own plane. "I book under a private account," Theo said gently, "for security and for privacy." Bethany lowered her phone slightly, but the recording light still blinked red. "He likes to see how people treat regular passengers. How they treat people who don't look rich. How they treat people like us." The words hung in the air like an indictment. Because that's exactly what this was. A test. Not an intentional one, perhaps, but a test nonetheless. And Veronica Ashford had failed spectacularly. Captain Davis straightened his shoulders. He'd made mistakes in his career. Everyone did. But he'd always prided himself on doing the right thing when it mattered most. And this was one of those moments where everything he stood for, everything he believed about fairness and justice and treating people with dignity, was being put to the test. "Ms. Ashford," he said, his voice formal now, official, carrying the weight of absolute authority. "Ms. Montgomery. You are both suspended, effective immediately, pending a full investigation. You'll work the remainder of this flight to Miami, as we have no replacement crew available, but upon landing you will report directly to Human Resources. You're not to have any further contact with Mr. Clark or his granddaughter. Is that understood?" Patricia Montgomery's voice came out strangled, desperate. "Captain, please. We were just following protocol. We were doing our jobs." "There is no protocol for racial discrimination," Captain Davis said, and his voice carried to every corner of that cabin, ensuring that every single passenger heard him loud and clear. "There is no protocol that allows you to harass passengers based on their appearance. There is no protocol that justifies questioning someone's right to be in first class because of the color of their skin. What happened here today was wrong. Was illegal. And it ends now. James?" James Chin appeared from the back of the cabin, walking quickly, his face a mixture of relief and residual guilt. He'd been standing in economy, replaying the moment when he'd walked away, when Veronica had ordered him to leave, when he'd chosen his job security over doing the right thing. And it had been eating him alive. "Yes, Captain? Your lead attendant for this flight now. Please ensure that Mr. Clark and his granddaughter have everything they need. Anything they want. Anything at all. And James?" "Yes, sir? Next time you see something wrong happening, I expect you to speak up immediately. I expect you to stand up for what's right, even when it's uncomfortable. Even when it might cost you something. Understood? James nodded, his throat tight. Yes, sir. I understand. He turned to Theo and Bethany, and his eyes were shining with unshed tears. I'm so sorry. Both of you. I should have said more. I should have done more. I saw what was happening and I stayed silent, and that was wrong. I was a coward. Bethany looked at him, this young man who'd been too afraid to speak up until it was almost too late, and something in her expression softened. Because she understood fear. She understood the paralysis that comes from not knowing what to do, from being afraid of making things worse. She'd felt it herself just minutes ago when she'd pulled out her phone with shaking hands. You stood up when it mattered, Bethany said quietly. When the captain asked about our tickets, you checked the manifest. You told the truth. Thank you. James wiped his eyes and nodded, then went to work making sure Theo and Bethany had everything they could possibly need. If this story is touching your heart, if Bethany's courage and Theo's grace are inspiring you, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button right now. Because stories like this matter. They need to be told. They need to be shared. And your support helps make that happen. But the reckoning wasn't finished yet. Veronica Ashford, standing near the galley, her entire world crumbling around her, her career imploding in real time, took a desperate, stumbling step forward. Her carefully constructed professional demeanor had shattered completely. Now she was just a woman watching everything she'd worked for disappear because of her own prejudice, her own assumptions, her own failure to see the humanity in two people who didn't look like they belonged. Mr. Clark, Veronica said, and her voice cracked. Please. I sincerely apologize. I made a terrible mistake. I wasn't thinking clearly. I let my assumptions cloud my judgment. Please, I have children. I have a mortgage. I have bills. My daughter is starting college next year. I need this job. Please don't let them fire me. Theo looked at her for a long moment. The cabin was silent, waiting to see what he would say, what he would do. This was his moment. The moment where he could destroy her with a word. Where he could make an example of her. Where he could exercise the full weight of his power and influence. But Theodore Clark hadn't built a $43 billion company by being cruel. He built it by being smart, by being fair, and by remembering where he came from. When he spoke, his voice was gentle but firm. So do a lot of people who get treated the way you treated us. People who don't have the privilege to make a phone call and fix it. People who get thrown off planes because someone decided they looked suspicious. People who get denied service because someone decided they didn't belong. People who get humiliated and degraded and told they're not good enough, and they have no recourse. No power. No voice. No billionaire grandfather to call a CEO. Veronica's tears were flowing freely now. I know. And I'm so sorry. I hope you learn from this, Theo said. I really do. I hope you think about what happened here today. I hope you examine your own biases and prejudices. I hope you ask yourself why you looked at me and my granddaughter and saw criminals instead of customers. I hope you become better. Because I don't want you fired, Ms. Ashford. I want you changed. There's a difference. Those words landed like a gift Veronica didn't deserve. Hope flickered across her face, desperate and fragile. The decision about your employment isn't mine to make, Theo continued. That's between you and Sapphire Airlines and the investigation they'll conduct. But what I can tell you is this. Your job doesn't define your worth as a person. Your choices do. Your actions do. How you treat people when you think no one important is watching. That's who you really are. And today, Ms. Ashford, you showed us who you are. The question now is, do you like what you saw? Veronica covered her face with her hands and walked toward the galley, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Patricia Montgomery followed her, equally devastated, equally uncertain about what came next. But there was one more person who needed to face what he'd done. One more person who'd shown his true colors during the confrontation. One more person who'd chosen comfort over courage, convenience over justice. Gerald Whitmore, who'd been sitting perfectly still in his seat for the last 10 minutes, hoping no one would notice him, hoping the attention would stay focused anywhere but on him, tried to gather his carry-on bag quietly. Tried to shift in his seat and become invisible. Tried to pretend he'd never been part of this at all. Tried to pretend he hadn't laughed at the check-in counter. Hadn't smirked during Veronica's interrogation. Hadn't told Theo and Bethany they should just move. Excuse me, sir? Bethany's voice stopped him cold. Gerald froze, his hand on his expensive leather bag, his face the picture of a man who desperately wanted to be anywhere else in the entire world. Every eye in the cabin turned toward him. I noticed you agreed with her, Bethany said, and her voice was calm but unyielding. Earlier when she wanted us to move to economy, you said we should just move. You said we were making a scene. You said we should stop being difficult and go sit in the back of the plane. Gerald's face went red. He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. I didn't mean. Look, I wasn't trying to. I was just trying to avoid conflict. Silence in the face of injustice is complicity, Bethany said, and her voice carried the weight of wisdom far beyond her 8 years. My grandfather taught me that. When you see something wrong and you say nothing, when you see someone being hurt and you look away, when you tell the victims to just accept their mistreatment to avoid making waves, you're not being neutral. You're not being peaceful. You're choosing a side. You're choosing the side of the person doing the harm. Your silence gave her permission. Your agreement gave her power. The cabin was absolutely silent. Gerald sat back down heavily in his seat, all the arrogance drained out of him, replaced by shame. Linda Rosenberg, sitting in row 3 with tears streaming down her face, smiled through her emotion. Well said, sweetheart. Very well said indeed. Gerald didn't say another word. He stared at his hands for the rest of the boarding process, thoroughly chastened, his expensive watch and designer clothes suddenly feeling like costume pieces. Like he'd been playing a role his entire life without ever questioning what that role cost other people. Flight 2847 finally pushed back from the gate and took off 17 minutes late, climbing into the darkening sky above New York, heading south toward Miami and whatever waited there. In the first-class cabin, the atmosphere had completely transformed. Where there had been tension and hostility and barely concealed racism, now there was something else. Not quite peace, but perhaps understanding. Perhaps the beginning of healing. Perhaps the recognition that change is possible when people are willing to face uncomfortable truths. As the plane leveled off at cruising altitude and the seatbelt sign dinged off, James Chin moved through the cabin with quiet, determined efficiency. He brought Bethany and Theo everything first class had to offer. Warm chocolate chip cookies still soft from the oven. Sparkling water with fresh lemon. Extra blankets in case they got cold. A children's activity kit for Bethany that she politely declined because she'd brought her own book about Rosa Parks and the Montgomery bus boycott. He brought Theo a glass of red wine that Theo accepted with a grateful nod and a warm smile. Thank you, James, Theo said. For everything. James nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. One by one, passengers came by to speak with them. To apologize. To show support. To express their admiration for Bethany's courage and their shame at their own silence. Linda Rosenberg stopped at their row, her novel completely forgotten, her heart too full to focus on fiction when reality had proven so much more compelling. Your granddaughter is remarkable, Mr. Clark. Truly remarkable. I have 3 grandchildren, and I hope they grow up to be half as brave as she is. Theo smiled, and this time it reached his eyes, warm and genuine and full of love. She gets it from her mother. And her father. They were extraordinary people. Brilliant and kind and fierce when they needed to be. I'm just the lucky one who gets to watch her shine. Who gets to see them live on in her. Linda squeezed Bethany's hand. Your parents would be so proud of you, sweetheart. Bethany's eyes filled with tears, but she smiled. Thank you. Raj Patel approached next, his laptop closed, his presentation abandoned, his priorities suddenly rearranged by witnessing firsthand what happens when good people stay silent. Mr. Clark, I'm ashamed I didn't speak up sooner. I knew what was happening was wrong. I felt it in my gut. But I stayed quiet because I didn't want to get involved, didn't want to make things worse, didn't want to risk being seen as difficult. I was a coward. Theo reached out and shook his hand, his grip firm and forgiving. You spoke up when it counted. That's what matters. The question isn't whether we're ever afraid or uncertain. We're all afraid sometimes. We all doubt ourselves. The question is what we do despite that fear. Do we let it paralyze us? Or do we push through it and do what's right anyway? You chose the latter. That takes courage too. Raj nodded, but the guilt still lingered in his eyes. I'll do better next time. That's all any of us can do, Theo said. Learn. Grow. Be better tomorrow than we were today. Other passengers offered words of support as they passed. Some took photos with Bethany and Theo with permission, wanting to remember this moment, wanting to share this story with their families. Some simply nodded respectfully, unable to find words adequate to express what they'd witnessed. The cabin that had been divided by prejudice and fear and silence was now united by a shared experience, a shared lesson learned the hard way. They'd all been tested today. Some had passed. Some had failed. But all of them had been changed. Somewhere over Virginia, as the cabin lights dimmed and most passengers settled in to doze or watch movies or read, Bethany turned to her grandfather. She'd been quiet for a while, processing everything that had happened, replaying it in her mind, trying to understand why people treated other people the way they did. Trying to make sense of a world that could be so beautiful and so ugly at the same time. "Grandpa," she said softly, tugging gently on his sleeve, "you never told me what the surprise was." "The Miami surprise." Theo's face transformed. All the weariness fell away like a shed coat. All the sadness from the confrontation evaporated. In its place was something bright and hopeful and full of love so pure it seemed to light him up from the inside. "We're going to Miami," Theo said, taking her small hands in his weathered ones, "because I'm opening a new community center there. A place for children who've lost their parents like you did. A safe place where they can heal, where they can learn, where they can grow. Where they can talk to other kids who understand what it's like to have that hole in your heart. Where they can discover that grief doesn't mean they're broken. That loss doesn't define them. That they can still have full, beautiful, meaningful lives even after the worst thing imaginable has happened." Bethany's eyes filled with tears. Her voice came out as a whisper. "You're doing that for me? I'm doing that for you and for every child like you. Every child who's lost a parent. Every child who feels alone. Every child who thinks they'll never be happy again. Your parents believed in helping people. In making the world better. In leaving things better than they found them. This center is their legacy. This is what they would have wanted. Are you naming it after Mom and Dad?" Theo nodded, his own eyes glistening. "The Clark Family Foundation. We'll have grief counselors and therapists. Educational programs. Art therapy. Music. Sports. A library. Everything children need to heal and thrive. And baby girl, I want you to help me run it. I know you're only 8 years old, but you're ready. You proved that today. You have your parents' courage. You have their compassion. You have their sense of justice. The foundation needs you. Those children need you. Because you understand what they're going through in a way I never could." Bethany threw her arms around her grandfather's neck and buried her face in his shoulder. For the first time in 2 years, she cried not from grief but from hope. Not from pain but from the possibility that something good could come from something so painful. That her parents' deaths didn't have to be the end of the story but could be the beginning of something that helped others. That maybe, just maybe, loss could be transformed into purpose. The other passengers who were still awake watched this moment unfold. This grandfather and granddaughter embracing at 30,000 feet, holding each other like they were the only solid things in an uncertain world. And many of them wiped away tears of their own, moved by the raw beauty of love and resilience and hope in the face of everything that had tried to break them. Here's my question for you, and I really want to know your answer. What would you have done in Bethany's shoes? Would you have had the courage to stand up at 8 years old? To pull out your phone and record? To speak truth to power when every adult around you was telling you to be quiet? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. The plane continued south through the night sky, carried by jet engines and physics and the collective will of everyone aboard to get where they were going. Bethany eventually fell asleep, her head resting against her grandfather's shoulder, his arm wrapped around her protectively, keeping her safe from a world that had already taken so much from her. Theo stayed awake, looking out the window at the darkness below, at the scattered lights of cities and towns, at the vast American landscape they were flying over. He thought about the day they'd had. The discrimination they'd faced. The courage his granddaughter had shown. The fear he'd felt when Veronica had reached for Bethany's phone. The pride that had swelled in his chest when Bethany had stood her ground. He thought about how his granddaughter had stood up for both of them when he'd been ready to simply endure it, to let it go, to avoid making a scene because that's what he'd learned to do after 72 years of being black in America. Pick your battles. Don't make trouble. Survive first, seek justice later. But Bethany hadn't been taught that kind of weary acceptance yet. She still believed the world could be fair. She still believed people would listen to truth. She still had the kind of hope that hadn't been beaten down by decades of disappointment. And watching her refuse to back down, refuse to be moved, refuse to accept injustice, Theo realized something profound. His granddaughter had taught him something today. She'd reminded him that sometimes silence isn't peace. Sometimes accommodation isn't wisdom. Sometimes you have to fight even when you're tired. Even when you've been fighting your whole life. Even when it would be so much easier to just move to the back of the plane and avoid the conflict. Because if people like Bethany didn't stand up, if people like Theo didn't use their voices and their power when they had it, then nothing would ever change. The Veronicas of the world would keep making assumptions. The Geralds would keep staying silent. The system would keep grinding on, crushing people who looked different, sounded different, didn't fit the narrow definition of who belonged. But change was possible. Theo had seen it today. He'd seen Captain Davis choose justice over convenience. He'd seen Linda speak up when it mattered. He'd seen James acknowledge his failure and commit to doing better. He'd seen passengers who'd started the boarding process as strangers united by their shared witness to injustice. Years later, when Bethany Clark was 16 years old and running the youth advocacy program at the Clark Family Foundation, she would tell the story of Flight 2847 dozens of times. She would tell it to rooms full of young people who felt powerless, who felt invisible, who felt like their voices didn't matter in a world run by adults who didn't understand them. And she would tell them, "My mom and dad taught me to be strong. My grandfather taught me to be kind. And that day on the plane taught me that speaking up isn't about being loud. It's about being brave. Even when you're scared. Especially when you're scared. Because the truth is, I was terrified that day. My hands were shaking when I pulled out that phone. My voice was shaking when I spoke. I wanted to cry. I wanted to hide. I wanted my grandfather to just agree to move so the scary lady would stop yelling at us. But I did it anyway. Not because I wasn't afraid, but because being afraid didn't mean I was wrong. Fear just meant it mattered. Fear meant there was something worth fighting for. The story of Flight 2847 spread far beyond that single airplane. Bethany's recording, which she never posted publicly out of respect for everyone involved, became part of an internal investigation at Sapphire Airlines. But the story itself spread through word of mouth, through passengers who told their families, through employees who shared it with colleagues, through a growing awareness that change was necessary. Theodore Clark made good on the quiet promise he'd made that day in first class. He donated $50 million to develop comprehensive anti-discrimination training programs for airline staff nationwide. Not just at Sapphire Airlines but at every major carrier in America. The program was called See Everyone, and it trained staff to recognize their own biases, to question their assumptions, to treat every passenger with dignity regardless of appearance, regardless of race, regardless of whether they looked like they belonged in first class or not. The training included real stories. Real testimonies from passengers who'd been discriminated against. Real consequences for staff who failed to uphold the standards. And slowly, gradually, things began to change. Not everywhere. Not perfectly. But change doesn't happen all at once. It happens one conversation at a time. One training session at a time. One person at a time deciding to be better than they were yesterday. Veronica Ashford did eventually lose her job. But not because Theodore Clark demanded it. She was terminated because the investigation revealed a pattern of similar behavior spanning years. Other passengers came forward with their own stories. Other complaints surfaced that had been buried in bureaucracy. The evidence was overwhelming. But 3 years later, Veronica did something remarkable. She reached out to the Clark Family Foundation and asked if she could volunteer. She wanted to help. She wanted to give back. She wanted to do the work of examining her biases and becoming the person she should have been all along. And eventually, she became a trainer for the See Everyone program, teaching other flight attendants about implicit bias and the damage it causes, using her own catastrophic failure as a cautionary tale about what happens when prejudice goes unchecked. James Chin became one of Sapphire Airlines' most respected senior flight attendants. He never forgot the lesson he learned that day about the cost of silence, about the importance of speaking up even when it's uncomfortable, even when it might put your job at risk. He became a mentor to younger crew members, teaching them that their job wasn't just to serve drinks and peanuts. Their job was to make every passenger feel valued, respected, seen. And Bethany? Bethany Clark grew up to be exactly what you'd expect from a child who'd stood up to injustice at 8 years old. She graduated high school at 15, college at 18 with degrees in social work and public policy. Everyone assumed she'd go into business like her grandfather, that she'd take over Clark Global Industries and become a billionaire CEO. But Bethany had different plans. She dedicated her life to the Clark Family Foundation. She built programs for children who'd experienced loss. She advocated for social justice reform. She spoke at schools and conferences and congressional hearings about the importance of teaching children to stand up for what's right. She created curricula on civil rights, on bystander intervention, on the difference between being nice and being kind. And she never forgot that day on Flight 2847. The day she was 8 years old and terrified and grieving and alone, except she wasn't alone because her grandfather was there. The day she learned that power isn't about how much money you have or what title you hold or who you know. Power is about what you do when it matters. Power is about speaking up when silence would be easier. Power is about recording the truth when lies are more convenient. Power is about being brave enough to say, "This is wrong and I won't accept it and I won't move." Theodore Clark passed away peacefully at age 87, surrounded by family in the community center he'd built in Miami. The Clark Family Foundation Center had served over 15,000 children by that point, providing grief counseling, educational support, and hope to kids who thought they'd never smile again. At his funeral, Bethany, now 24 years old and the executive director of the foundation, told the story of Flight 2847 one final time. She told it to a church full of hundreds of people whose lives Theo had touched, whose futures he'd invested in, whose dignity he'd defended. And she ended with this: "My grandfather taught me that the measure of a person isn't how they treat those who can help them. It's how they treat those who can't." He lived that truth every single day of his life. He never forgot where he came from. He never forgot what it felt like to be invisible, to be dismissed, to be judged by his appearance instead of his character. And he spent his entire life making sure that everyone he encountered felt seen, felt valued, felt human. That's his legacy. That's what he gave the world. And that's what I promise to give too. The story of Flight 2847 is ultimately a story about courage. About an 8-year-old girl who'd lost everything and still found the strength to stand up. About a grandfather who taught her that wealth means nothing if you lose your humanity in the process of acquiring it. About strangers who learned that silence makes you complicit. About systems that can change when people demand better. It's a story that asks each of us a simple question. What will you do when you witness injustice? Will you look away because it's easier? Will you rationalize because getting involved feels risky? Will you tell yourself it's not your business, not your problem, not your fight? Or will you be like Bethany Clark? Will you pull out your phone and create a record? Will you speak truth even when your voice shakes and your hands tremble? Will you stand between the vulnerable and those who would harm them? Will you be brave even when you're scared? Especially when you're scared. Because that's what heroes do. They don't wait for perfect moments or perfect courage or perfect circumstances. They act anyway. They speak up anyway. They stand up anyway. They do what's right not because it's easy but because it's necessary. The world changes one brave act at a time. One person standing up. One person saying, "No, this is wrong." One person refusing to move to the back of the plane. Stand up. Speak out. Change the world. Just like Bethany did.